Well, welcome. I'm Alan Krueger, and I'm the director of the Survey Research Center here at Princeton, which is one of the organizing forces behind today's event. And I want to thank Ed Freeland, who's the associate director of the Survey Research Center, for doing the hard work of inviting all of the panelists and putting this event on the calendar. I assume that many of you are like me and you check the polls frequently. I went to Real Clear Politics this morning, as I often do, and there you could see not only national polls but also the state polls, and it seems that there's a fair amount of variability. So just in today, to give you an example, for Indiana, one poll, the CNN Time poll, had McCain ahead by 5 points. And the Research 2000 poll had the race tied in Indiana. Yesterday, two polls for North Carolina, two polls for Ohio. One had McCain ahead by a point, one had Obama ahead by 6 points. Then there were three polls yesterday for Virginia. One had Obama ahead by 2 points, one by 10 points, and one by 12 points. Now, I teach statistics, and I know about sampling variance. And certainly, you don't expect every poll to give the same number, but there seems to be more than just sampling variance at work from that very small sample. So we thought it would be very helpful to put together a panel to try to understand how much the public should trust state polls. And also, in this race, given the potential role of race, we thought it was particularly worthwhile to discuss the effect that race may have played in other elections with biracial pairings. And I was also going to mention that in addition to going to Real Clear Politics, I also go to Sam Wang's website about every day. I think Sam may be here. Anyway, there you can find a very interesting discussion of a paper by Dan Hopkins from Harvard, about the Wilder or Bradley effect. So I'm going to be very brief and turn over to the panelists. The idea is that we will proceed in alphabetical order. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes, and I'll give them a very short introduction before they speak. And we have a wonderful group of presenters here, a wonderful mix. Our first presenter is going to be Chris Achen, who many of you, I'm sure, know is the Roger William Strauss Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Political Politics at Princeton. And he has done research on political methodology, American politics, and international relations. So let me turn it over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Alan. My job here is, for those of you of a certain age, is to be the Ed McMahon while the real panelists come on in a couple minutes here and tell the interesting stuff. So what I want to do is just briefly give a little bit of background history and then a for instance or two to give a framework for thinking about this, our topics today. Let me see if I can get this to work. For most political scientists, Alan slipped into referring to the political science department here rather than the politics department, and I don't object to that. People do a lot of talking during a campaign about issues and personalities and ideology, but most of us believe that this is heavily self-justification. People have a prior position, they have an ideological view, or more commonly a party identification, and that structures what it is that they say. So if you go to dinner parties these days, one or two sentences about the candidates and you know which side people are on, they perceive things in a certain way, and it's the candidate choices that drive the ideological positions and the views of the candidates rather than vice versa. So the key things that we've found in the last 50 years of electoral research are that party identification plus how are things lately, mostly economically, but sometimes in foreign policy as well, and then who are these guys who are running. Those are the key things, and with those three factors we can usually predict pretty well. The newspapers spend a lot of time on on other things, but that's not so much what's going on. So these three things are crucial: party ID, retrospections about the economy, and then candidate and campaign effects. Now, what's crucial for our topic today is that people are often not able to see in advance how they're going to feel in November. So in February, a lot of Republicans were really enthusiastic about Barack Obama. He was talking about being a nonpartisan, cross-partisan kind of guy. They thought that was great, and he got a lot of votes in the early open primaries and caucuses from people of quite conservative views because they thought that would be terrific. Now, of course, those people have caught on in the time period since then, and so the apparent leads that Obama had in Montana and Alaska, for example, versus Republican candidates have, of course, evaporated, and the Republicans in those states now see that they want to vote for a Republican. Now, these effects differ by state, so that even if the Electoral College didn't exist, we'd still want to look at state polls. Looking at state polls goes back a ways. So this is from the New York Times in 1932. And what the Times did was look at the Literary Digest poll. This was a very famous poll done in the 20s and 30s. The Literary Digest was a kind of Reader's Digest, and it had a very broad circulation, mostly middle class and upper middle class circulation, but not exclusively. And they would get a very large sample at election time of their subscribers, often as many as 1 million respondents. So they had pretty good data by state. The problem with that was that the poll was always more Republican than the electorate due to the composition of their subscribers, and that was well known at the time. So this gentleman, Fabian Franklin, whom I don't know anything, was apparently just a journalist working for the Times, took the following idea. He looked at the 1932 poll and he looked at what people had said about how they had voted the time before in 1928, Al Smith versus Herbert Hoover. And then he just took the fraction of people who said that they were fed up with the Republicans and they were going to switch from the Republicans to the Democrats. And he took that number, that fraction, from the poll and applied it to the actual vote in 1928 by state. And he did a forecast. He forecast 48 states. So the key prediction successes here are the upper left, where he predicted that a Democrat, namely Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, would win in 32, and Roosevelt actually did win. There were 42 such states. At the lower right, he predicted that 3 states would be Republican, and they actually were: Delaware, Maine, and Vermont. The East Coast always updating a little more slowly than the rest of the country. And then 3 states that he predicted would go to the Democrats and which failed to do so. Again, all East Coast states, and Pennsylvania, of course, having the big Republican machine in Philadelphia that lived to fight one last time before Pennsylvania began to lean Democratic in 1936. The point is, he got 45 out of 48 correct. How was this done? Well, I've said most of this. The crucial thing to note here is that he's taking the what the respondents say about their switching rate and assuming that that number is the same both for subscribers to the digest who didn't respond to the poll and for people who didn't respond to the digest. Those are substantial assumptions. He also assumed that no 1928 Democrats would switch to the Republicans. And of course, that's not likely to be correct, particularly since Smith was a Catholic in 28, a lot of Catholics in the East. Some of them deviated one time. Nevertheless, pretty sophisticated for 1932. When you can get 45 out of 48, should congratulate yourself. We struggled to do that well since. What's key in most elections? Net of the party ID balance. In other words, we put the party ID balance aside because I can forecast how Utah and Massachusetts are going to vote for you right now. In fact, I could have done that 3 or 4 years ago. Utah's reliably Republican, Massachusetts is reliably Democratic, and there are quite a few states in that category. So what causes the deviations around the usual voting patterns? It's typically the short-term economic retrospections. So this is work with Larry Bartels. It's an example from the 1936 election. The explanatory variable here on the horizontal axis is the election year income change, how much people's income changed from the year before. We're in the middle of the Depression, so some of these numbers are gigantic. For example, in South Dakota there at the lower left, income dropped 25% from the year before. It's drought in an agricultural state. You can see North Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma suffering as well. And other states gained as much as 20 or 25%. So these are effects now you can see without your bifocals. And the impacts here are very substantial. So at the upper end, some states went up by as much as 10 percentage points or more. At the lower right, South Dakota went down almost 10. So these are 20 percentage point gaps, and they show you what's going on in more simple kinds of cases. Now the question that we want to know is, when times are bad, people vote against the incumbents. Is that rational on their part, or is it just, kicking the dog? And this is an interesting question right now, where Democrats and Republicans had a kind of round-robin coalition to make sure that subprime mortgages were taken on by the banks. There's plenty of blame to go around on that one. But it's Republicans who are taking the hit. The issues here for the voter are sometimes what happens in the economy is due to the government's actions, but more often it's not. So for instance, drought and hail affect crops and reduce the vote for incumbents, but no government controls the weather. Nevertheless, people vote against the incumbents when times are bad. In fact, there are even more dramatic examples of that. In 1916, there were shark attacks along the New Jersey coast. Woodrow Wilson was in office, former president of Princeton, of course, longtime New Jersey resident, had been governor. Summer season was destroyed. The Jaws movie is based on exactly this set of stuff. If you've seen the movie, you know exactly how it went that summer in New Jersey. Peter Benchley copied from the history. He was till he passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a Princeton resident. Here are the effects. Some of you have seen this, but maybe new to some of you. This is the change from 1912 to 1916 in the vote. Woodrow Wilson ran both times. At the left there, you can see the change in New Jersey. It's less than a percentage point. Wilson ran almost exactly the same both times in New Jersey as a whole. And the two central bars there are Monmouth County and Ocean County, which are coastal counties, where Jersey Shore counties, where the attacks took place. He was down there. And then Spring Lake and Beach Haven, those are the two townships where the actual attacks occurred and where two guys died, are at the right there. Wilson lost as many votes in those two townships as people lost during as the Republicans lost during the Depression. It's more than about 10 points in each place. So people voted against the incumbents because of shark attacks. That's how we think about things. So here's some current data. This is from Jay Kost's blog. Jay is a University of Chicago graduate student whose dissertation is being seriously delayed because he's writing a blog and working for Real Clear Politics. But he's my dissertation great-grandchild, so I complain about his dissertation to him sometimes. This is the McCain-Obama balance. The red is McCain. This is essentially the month of September, this month of September. You can see that in the early part of that period, McCain was enjoying a little lead, mostly from his post-convention bounce. But as soon as we start getting into these vertical bars here are various aspects of the subprime crisis. As soon as we start getting into that, things go south for him very quickly, and he's farther down now than he has been in many months. And it's essentially the same kind of behavior, I suspect, we'll find out with later research, but it's the same kind of behavior by the voters in an otherwise very close race. It's been blown open in the last month due to the economic crises. Now these effects will play out state by state. We have some states that are already pretty troubled, Michigan and Ohio being the outstanding example. We have other coastal states that engaged in a lot of risk-taking behavior on subprime lending, and they're struggling. Other states had more conservative banking practices, and it'll probably have less impact on them. They're doing relatively well. So we need to track state by state. But state polls are often done cheaply and unscientifically, and they're notoriously sloppy. I just had a conversation with somebody a few weeks ago doing some polls. I messaged them. The numbers looked a little off to me. They looked too much toward McCain. And eventually I had a conversation in which they said, yeah, we screwed up the weights totally. We essentially dropped the black people. But, you know, close enough. So that's the kind of thing that you get. Plus, turnout is notoriously hard to forecast. So these are the New Hampshire primary polls. There were 7 the weekend before the New Hampshire primary. The first 7 bars are the results of those polls in New Hampshire. They all showed Obama margins by a certain amount. I was talking in Taiwan at this time, and I sent a chart a lot like this. I had 1 or 2 of these that I didn't have in hand. And I sent it to them, and with skeptical remarks about it, because I was giving a talk about forecasting. And they messaged me back that they were worried that, you know, it was so obvious that Obama was going to win that I was going to look bad giving a talk on forecasting. Well, this is the actual. There at the right. Clinton won it, mostly because of much bigger turnout than was expected. In particular, it brought out lower middle class and working class people who are her central supporters. So by the time I got to, after my 24-hour plane trip to Taiwan, I was fine. But the point is, you can't tell. You just can't tell. And even when the polls are as consistent as these were, you can easily be mistaken. Turnout really matters. This is turnout in the caucuses and in the primaries and the Clinton-Obama balance in each of those two. Obama owes his nomination to his success in caucus states, where he won very handily, as you can see there on the left. In the right, in the primary states, and I should say turnout was about 6% in the caucus states, was about 30% in the primary states, and Clinton actually won those. So it makes a big difference. Obama was a lot smarter about mobilizing in the caucus states to make up for his other disadvantages, and as a result, he's the nominee. Wayne Gretzky was asked once, the great hockey player, how he always managed to skate to the puck. And he said, I don't skate to the puck. I skate to where the puck is going to be. The problem with polls is they skate to where the puck is. And what we really need to think about is how to skate toward where they're going to be. That's partly a task of incorporating economic information for the reasons I've said. People vote against the incumbents when times are hard, and it's exactly that aspect of the polls that's not taken into account when you're 2-3 months out. People don't know how bad they're going to feel right at the time of the election. We need to think about that. We also need to think about getting turnout right, and we need to correct or discard or downweight, and my colleagues will have something to say about that, the unscientific polls. So point is that these state polls are crucial. They have a lot of difficulties. We've been trying to deal with them for about 75 years. We have a lot of challenges remaining, and my fellow panelists will take those topics up.
Thank you, Chris. And after watching the stock market fall again today, this election might have a lot more in common with 1932 than you had suggested. The second speaker is Andrew Gelman, who is a professor of statistics and political science at Columbia University and director of Columbia's Applied Statistics Center. I thought I'd also give a plug for his new book, Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, which does, I think, a really illuminating job trying to make sense of election data and polling data. So without further ado, Andrew.
Can you set up my thing? I have a talk on YouTube.
I can try.
So I have little to say, if anything, about state polls. The state poll topic got added after the panel got set up, I think. I will say you can, for reasons that Chris said, you can pretty much ignore almost all the polls. I think there are way too many polls being done. If it was up to me, the code of ethics of pollsters would require that respondents be paid to participate in polls, since after all the pollsters make money off of this and the responders don't. So it doesn't seem quite fair to me. I don't know if I would characterize the blaming the Republicans for the economy as the equivalent of a shark attack, because it does seem like there have been some economic problems that have been pointed out for a couple of years now. It's very hard, as Chris was saying, to separate reactions to the news now, to separate that from the fact that the economy hasn't been going that well and that people were eventually going to be focusing on this when the election came around. So I think that the shark attacks comparison is maybe a little bit too charitable to the Republican Party. Also, regarding polls, primary elections are harder than general elections. Primary elections are much more unstable. You have multiple candidates, and the candidates that you do have aren't so well separated in ideology. And as a result, how do I do this? And as a result, it's much harder to forecast these things. With regard to state polls, we don't really need to ever have a state poll because there are so many national polls. It would be possible to get state-level inferences without that. I think one piece of the picture that Chris didn't mention, I think because he's so familiar with it, is that we can separate out election outcomes into the national election and the relative positions of the states. And so what state polling is giving you, whether it be a state poll or equivalently the state summary of a national poll, what it's telling you is how the states stand relative to each other. And we don't need to aggregate 50 little state polls to find out what's happening in the country. Now, what I do want to talk about briefly is the differences between states, not so much the measurement issues, but what's actually out there, what we've learned from the measurement. And I think the remaining two speakers will talk more about the issues of measurement themselves, which somebody has to do. So I would say that the other speakers here, the two later speakers, are doing the dirty work, and Chris and I get to take those pretty numbers and spin theories. So I'll spin some theories too. Every election, 2008 included, can be seen as a contest between two views of the future: liberal dynamism or fearful conservatism. Is the majority of Americans confident enough to look to the future, or does fear keep them in the past? Or to put it another way, what vision is going to win this time, the liberal nanny state or conservative policies that unleash the power of the free market while respecting the effectiveness of families and local communities? We really have two stories there, two stories about political polarization. We have the story of the red states and the blue states, the culture war of the liberal elites and the ordinary Americans in the middle of the country. That's story number one. And story number two is the story of the two Americas, of the rich versus the poor, the people who are left out, and the winners and the losers. Those are different stories of polarization. Can we reconcile them? Our story begins with an article in the Atlantic Monthly by David Brooks after the 2000 election, where he drove from wealthy liberal Montgomery County, Maryland, to rural conservative Franklin County in Pennsylvania, a place with no Starbucks, Pottery Barn, no Borders, no Barnes & Nobles, a lot fewer sun-dried tomato concoctions on restaurant menus, and a lot more meatloaf platters. Is that real? It is real. Here's the map from 2004. You see the latte-swilling Democrats on the coast and the ordinary Walmart shoppers in the middle of the country. This is not a graphical illusion. Here's a scatter plot showing the 50 states vote share by income. Democrats really are doing better in rich states. Bush won the 15 poorest states on the left side of the graph, starting with nearly 60% in Mississippi, the poorest state. On the other hand, Kerry and Gore before him won in Connecticut, in 8 of the 10 next richest states. As TV pundit Tucker Carlson said, okay, but here's the fact that nobody ever mentions. Democrats win rich people. Over 100,000 in income, you are likely more than not to vote for Democrats. People never point that out. Rich people vote liberal. I don't know what that's all about, saith Tucker. Tucker was wrong. Rich people vote Republican. If rich people were a state, they'd vote like Alabama, Kansas, or Texas. You see them up there. If poor people were a state, they'd vote like Massachusetts, even though Massachusetts is much richer than Alabama, Kansas, or Texas. And richer people vote more Republican in non-presidential elections as well. Now, this is what David Brooks did. He was in Maryland. These are the 23 counties of Maryland and Baltimore, plotting the Republicanness of the county versus the income of the county. He started in Montgomery County, Maryland, and it was not hard for him to go northwest on that map and also geographically to find a poorer, more Republican county. To continue with some fact-based stereotyping, the dark here represents more. There are more Walmarts in the more Republican parts of the country and more Starbucks in places near Seattle. The point here is that David Brooks is right. Different parts of the country really do feel different. These cultural differences are real, not a map illusion at all. Now let's take David Brooks and drop him in Texas. In Texas, it would have been very difficult for him to write his story. The richest county in Texas is Collin County, a suburb of Dallas, highly Bush-supporting. The poorest county, Zavala, was highly Kerry and Gore-supporting. In Texas, where you live is very predictive of how you are voting in a way that's not true in Maryland. How wealthy you are is associated with how you vote. But it depends on where you live. In some states, the rich are very different from the poor and not in other places. Here, again, more wonderful things from all the hardworking pollsters who gave us data, which then we process and then show our thanks by saying that there are too many polls. Here we see the probability of voting for Bush as a function of your income in Mississippi, which is the poorest state, Ohio, which is a middle-income state, and Connecticut, which is the richest state. Boris, my co-author, calls this the Anna Karenina graph. Tolstoy said, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. You see that poor people are similar in different sorts of states, but rich people are very different. And in fact, the difference, it's not just these three states. The differences between red states and blue states in voting behavior are real. Not an illusion of the map, but these differences occur among rich voters, not poor voters. Now, I'd briefly like to explain, now that we've seen this paradox, how people could have gotten confused about this. And I will skip this pretty map here. It's in the book, though. From two sides politically, Nicholas Kristof wrote that one of the Republican Party's major successes over the last few decades has been to persuade many of the working poor to vote for tax breaks for billionaires. Well, not really. Well, many of the working poor, but a minority of the working poor. Most working poor are Democrats, and that's been true for decades. It's hardly a Republican Party's success. They haven't increased their vote among the poor by any means, or the working poor. On the other side of the political divide, Michael Barone asked who are the trust funders, people with enough money not to have to work for a living or not to have to work very hard. These people tend to be very liberal politically. Aware that they have done nothing to earn their money, they feel a certain sense of guilt. They're citizens of the world with contempt for those who feel chills up their spines when they hear the Star-Spangled Banner. I think a lot of us can relate to this. It's wrong, though. Richer people are consistently more Republican. Now, why am I picking on these people? Because they generally know what they're talking about. Nicholas Kristof can get anyone in the world to answer his phone in 5 minutes. Michael Barone knows more about American political geography than I will ever know. When smart, well-informed people get things right, that's not very interesting. When they get things wrong, then it's worth studying. I will skip Thomas Frank. One of everybody's favorite quotes is from the New Yorker mover critic in 1972. I can't believe Nixon won. I don't know anybody who voted for him. She did not say that. She was not an idiot. She read the newspaper, and she, I'm sure, was pretty sure Nixon was going to win in 1972. Yet this quote, like, really, it touches a nerve in all of us. And it touches a nerve, I believe, because it relates to the cognitive phenomenon of availability bias, the tendency for us to make our inferences based on what's near us. As I like to say, at Columbia, if you live in New York, you think everybody has roaches in their apartment. And maybe you also think that nobody voted for Nixon. She did not say that, but there's a more sophisticated mistake that I think people do make. Michael Barone again, the expert, it evidently irritates many liberals to point out that their party gets heavy support from super affluent people of fashion and does not run very well among the common people. False. How could he say that? Well, Michael Barone lives in the upper left corner of this map. He knows a lot of liberal, rich people. In the middle of the map are the average Americans. They're in the middle by definition, because that's how I've drawn this map. And so it's natural for Barone and people like him to extrapolate, maybe people like you at Princeton, to extrapolate and think you're in the upper left, and so therefore everybody else must be on the lower right. Well, no, that's not right, actually. You're in the upper left, some people are in the lower right, most people are in the other quadrants. And I would call this a second-order availability bias. Now, as I've said a few thousand times already, rich people vote Republican. However, there are some groups of the population for whom the richer you are, the more democratic you are. One of those groups, journalists. And so perhaps, not a surprise, richer journalists in big city newspapers and so forth. But easy to make that sort of mistake. So far I've explained the paradox and how it's tied into popular misunderstanding. So I'm going to briefly talk about what this means for American politics. The red-blue map is new. Here's the map 30 years ago. There was no pattern 30 years ago of Democrats winning rich states or poor states. We have lots more graphs in the book to demonstrate this. It is a trend happening over the past few decades. David Brooks et al. Were correct to make a big deal about rich people on the rich states in the East Coast and the West Coast going Democratic. It's new. Okay. What's not new is that rich people have been voting Republican. There's been roughly a 15 to 20-point gap between rich and poor in how they vote for decades. So what's new is that rich states are Democratic, and that's new among. And again, we've learned this from all these polls, national polls that we've broken down by state, not actually state polls. Rich states are more democratic, but that difference is primarily among the richer voters. The poor are similar across states, but the rich are different. In poor states, rich people are more economically conservative than poor people, and they vote much more Republican. It's straightforward. A rich person in Mississippi, it's a simple equation. You're conservative, you vote Republican. Richer people in places like New Jersey and Connecticut are torn. They are economically conservative and socially liberal. 30 years ago, this wasn't an issue because 30 years ago, people didn't decide how to vote for president based on social issues. Social issues have become more important in recent decades. Even in the Reagan era, social issues were not particularly important in how people voted. So this is new. Now, I know I've brought up a lot, and there's a lot more in our book. I want to leave you thinking about three things. That Democrats win the rich states, but Republicans do better among richer voters within each state. The culture war is real, but is concentrated among the upper half of the income distribution. Other data that are in our book but not shown here, we see that religion is more important among rich people than among poor people. If you want to predict people's votes, that's what we call a religion and God, guns, and gays. We call those the opiate of the elites. So everything you've been hearing about, David Brooks, et cetera, red America versus blue America, it is really happening, but it's not happening at the low end of income. It's happening at the high end of income. Now, if I've refuted some stereotypes about Republicans and Democrats and also giving you a sense of how the scientific study of all these polls gives us insight beyond looking at horse races, then I think I've done my job for today.
Thank you. Now we're going to turn to those who actually conduct the polls. The next speaker is Larry Hugick, who is chairman of Princeton Survey Research Associates International, a nationally recognized expert in public opinion, pre-election polling, and policy research. Larry conducts the regular Newsweek poll and advises the magazine on social trends and politics. He has also conducted research studies on rally events, on presidential approval, and on polling during biracial elections.
How do I get to my slides?
Remember what they were called?
Making sense. Yeah, making sense. Okay, and then I just hit this.
Yep, and then spacebar will work with it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Indeed, I am from the trenches. I am actually somebody who does state polls. And so my subject matter here is going to be quite different. And I should say that when I started preparing for this, when we found out what the topic would be for today, what I started out writing didn't necessarily end up that way, because writing this and my own professional career are kind of intertwined. So interesting where I'll end up, that to show you, how this all got put together. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about the accuracy of the polls 4 years ago, when the last presidential race. And then I'm going to bring it up into 2008 and talk about why maybe what we know from 2004 won't necessarily apply in exactly the same way to this particular general election. And I think I got a taste of it in my professional career in just the past week, and I'll share that with you. So to start, let's look at the record of the polls in 2004, and specifically, how accurate were they? Can you trust the polls? How good are they at estimating the final results when you look at a poll conducted late in the campaign? So for that, I went to, my source was the National Council on Public Polls, NCPP. They do a review every 4 years of how the polls did. So let's look at the national polls versus the state polls. Are the state polls less accurate? As you might think, at least based on 2004, their accuracy wasn't quite up to the national level. There were 16 national polls. Average candidate error was about 1%. And it was about double that on the state polls. Of course, there are a lot more state polls, a lot of different methodologies, tighter budgets, some practitioners who may not have the highest standards. So that would be expected. What about the methodology used for the poll? We looked at traditional methodology, which these days would be telephone polls with live interviews, and compared it with two other methodologies that have emerged in recent decades. Of course, the internet polling, which basically relies on a panel rather than a random sample, and IVR, which is interactive voice response, also known as automated polls or robo-polls, if you like. And those of us who have used traditional polling methodologies all our career were, of course, very skeptical of these new methodologies. What happened in 2004? If we look at the final results, the Internet polls, as we thought, were less accurate. They don't have random samples, less reliable, as we thought. But the IVR, the so-called robopolls where you are called, you hear a recorded voice, and you enter the answers into your phone keypad, they were as accurate or better than the traditional polls. And 2004 was when they really made a name for themselves. Another thing that's come into great use in recent years on websites is averaging the polls. I remember years ago, the economists used to have their poll of polls, but now everybody does it. You know, pollster.com, Real Clear Politics, they all have it. So how about if we use those averages? How accurate are those averages in estimating the outcome of the election? So as you see in the national polls, they did pretty good. They had about a 2.5 point, the actual result was about a 2.5 point difference between Bush and Kerry, but the polls had it 1.5, quite close. Okay, so the question is, well, how about the state polls? And when you look at state polls, I wanted to look at the state polls that really mattered when it came down to the nitty-gritty. And as you may recall, it came down to really 3 big prizes, those being Ohio, Florida, and Pennsylvania. Whoever won 2 out of those 3 states would win the election. So what did the polls say, and how do they do? Here's the story, and it's a mixed picture. The state polls, if you looked at Ohio, they were pretty much spot on. And again, there's variation within, but this is the average. They did quite well. 2-point difference, that's how it ended up. Pennsylvania at the bottom, not quite as accurate, but they still showed a Kerry in this case ahead, and Kerry did win slightly by a few 1.5 more than the average showed. But Florida, not so good. In Florida, the actual vote was actually a 5-point Bush lead, whereas the final poll average suggested it was going to be essentially a tie. So states are harder to do. I think we're going to be very skeptical about Florida until we see that change. There were 5 polling organizations that polled in all 3 of those states. Here's the average error on the margin. This was calculated by me, so I don't want to credit it to anybody else. But 5 organizations, and as you see, there were some differences in how they did. There were the 2 polls at the top. 2 of the polls at the top, Rasmussen and Survey USA, are IVR polls. Of course, the one that's scored at the very top, Mason-Dixon, does use a traditional methodology. And a surprise for many of us was that actually Gallup did the poorest job of them all, and in fact managed to get every state wrong. They had Kerry ahead in Florida and Ohio, and Bush ahead in Pennsylvania. I mean, what conclusions can you draw from this? Well, I mean, I think when you look at the different methodologies these polls use, it doesn't show necessarily that IVR is superior to traditional polling, because Mason-Dixon was right up there. It also doesn't show that the polls that use the controversial practice of weighting by party ID are better or worse. Rasmussen does it, Mason-Dixon doesn't, Gallup doesn't, Survey USA doesn't, Zogby does. Nothing there. I think if you look at what really strikes me about the firms that ended up on top is that they do a lot of work in states. They do a tremendous volume of polls, and they have a lot of experience working at the state level, whereas Gallup is more known for national. And I don't know specifically what Gallup says the source of the error was, but it may be that simply applying your national knowledge at the state level is not enough. Okay, 2008. Can the polls repeat this record? Well, I hope so, but there's a reason to think that we as an industry might not. And here's why. In 2004, only about 5% of U.S. households were wireless only, didn't have landline telephones. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, that percent continues to rise steadily, and it was close to 16% a year ago. The estimate is perhaps 17% right now. So for traditional methodologies, for telephone polls that don't use cell phones, we have a coverage problem. There's a lot of people who we can't reach, and that can be a problem, as we know with the Literary Digest poll that was mentioned earlier. Technically, here's the problem. When we want to get a sample, we need a sample of all age groups. We need a nice balance. So we have to weight things so that they're correctly represented. But what happens is that our unweighted sample of young people, what you see on the slide is the percentage of 18 to 34-year-olds in Pew Research Center polls. And the unweighted survey statistic in blue shows you how the number of those voters, that age group, has dropped in recent years. Now it's running between 10 points lower than the weighted parameter. As the population ages, there are less 18 to 34-year-olds in the population as a percent, but that difference between how many interviews we get with that group and how much weighting we need to correct it, it continues to expand, and that can be a lot of trouble. The difference between having 250 people in your sample and 150 is a big difference. Here's the other problem with this coverage issue. If the people that we interview are the same as the people we don't interview in their political attitudes and preferences, we're fine. But what if they're not? And we're just starting to see some evidence that they may not be. Pew Research Center just put out a release recently. You may have seen it. Looking specifically at age, when we ask the horse race question in a poll that includes cell phones and a poll that's limited to landline phones. For people who are 30 and older, the differences basically don't exist. But for people who are under 30, there's a 6-point difference. In other words, when you include the cell phone people, Obama's helped. That the young people with cell phones are somewhat different than the landline group, and just weighting them up may not be enough. So, how's this going to affect us? We as an industry, the traditional pollsters, have done research. Pew Research Center has done a lot. ABC News, I know, just recently released some findings of their own. And we know how we are affected. It's fairly small. We have some sense of it. We can actually call people on cell phones now, and we can do polls that way. However, what about IVR polls? We don't know a lot about how IVR polls are affected by this. How are they reaching young people? We can at least call people back. We can ask to speak to the youngest person in the household. They can't do that. Also, they're not even allowed to call on cell phones, so how you do research on this, I'm not quite sure. And here is a case that brought me to this thinking that just happened this week. We poll in Minnesota for the Star Tribune in Minneapolis. We just did a poll. It was released in their Sunday paper. 18-point lead for Obama over McCain. nearly the same time, actually the day before, we knew about our results. Survey USA came out with a poll showing McCain with a 1-point lead. That's not sampling error. There's something going on there. As you see, we had one other post-debate poll to go on, done after the first presidential debate. That was by CNN Time ORC, another one that uses live interviews. They were closer to us, although not quite as wide. So, why were these polls different? Here's what I focused on. A lot of the partisans went after party ID. You have an improper party ID distribution. Well, even if you change the party ID distribution, it would not have made up this huge difference. Here's where the difference seems to be. It's by age. It's that variable we said is being affected by cell phones. Take a look at age 18 to 34. Survey USA had Obama ahead by 4. We have Obama ahead by 36, which, by the way, is what the national polls suggest that age group is voting for Obama. 35 to 49, the next oldest group. Survey USA has McCain ahead by 16, whereas we show that group pretty close to other groups of older voters past 35. So, to me, this suggests that there's an age problem that's not really being talked about much. We're concerned about race, but there's an age issue that when you look at state polls, you really want to know, what's the breakdown by age? How many young people are in your sample? Also, this is just happening within the last few days. Another case. I looked at Ohio, because a bunch of polls have come out of there. And more. Here we have four polls that were post-debate. The two that were done by IVR both have it essentially even, actually with McCain with a 1-point lead. That sound familiar? The polls that were done, one by live interviewers and one by mail, I mean, that's another story. Mail is an interesting, that's a rare poll. Not many mail polls are done, but it has a good record. They both showed Obama with the lead, 6 and 7 points respectively. And again, younger voters are different. If you look at Survey USA in Ohio, they had Obama only ahead by 3 points among 18 to 34-year-olds. Again, that's a group that nationally we're finding is Obama has a 30-point lead or so. And what does ABC News Washington Post show among their younger sample? They have 34 for Obama, 18 to 29. And the Dispatch poll done by mail, not as big, but still bigger for Obama than Survey USA. So, in conclusion, I think if you want to make sense of the polls in 2008, instead of concentrating so much on party ID, which is actually wrapped up with preference, the two actually move together. You need to look at age and see if there's a difference in the polls in age. And I thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Our fourth and final speaker is Joe Lenski. Joe is the co-founder and executive vice president of Edison Media Research. He is an expert on the operation and organization of survey research and has been involved in every major exit poll conducted in the U.S. in the last decade for the television networks. I would also add that Joe is a 1987 graduate of Princeton University in mechanical engineering. And I might as well mention that he also went to the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much. I want to thank New Jersey APOR and New York APOR and Princeton University for inviting me. I think, though, I'm more likely here just because I'm the New York A4 member that lives closest to campus in Gelman. So I think I'm here more for that than what my knowledge on state polls. But I'm going to go old school and not have a presentation, PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to make some observations about how we use state polls and talk about some things you might be looking at as you use and consume state polls this year. Alan said I'm Executive Vice President of Edison Media Research. We conduct the exit polls, and we're going to be in the news in 28 days. Fortunately, we're not in the news now. We don't do pre-election polls, so I get to be a little critic now, and then 28 days later I'll get the payback when you guys criticize the work we do. We're going to have an army of over 3,000 interviewers and vote reporters out in the field in all 50 states collecting data for the networks and the newspapers and the Associated Press to use on Election Day and thereafter to try to explain how the vote turned out the way it is. But we too are consumers of state polls. Even though we don't do pre-election state polling ourselves, we look at it in ways to make decisions in terms of how to allocate our resources, in terms of what to expect, in terms of the demographics we're looking towards on Election Day, and which are going to be the competitive states on election night. So we are consumers of state polls just like you are. As Larry said, the record of the pre-election state polls in the last few general elections has been pretty good. In 2000, 2004, even 2006, these aggregations, these aggregates of the state polls that you see on many websites now have been pretty good predictors. In fact, in 2004, there were only 2 states that were wrong according to those aggregates, and both of those states had a 1-point margin. So this aggregation tends to work recently. But you know, past is not prologue. In fact, there's a prologue before, there's a past even before the past of when pre-election polls don't work. And I think there are some lessons there that we need to look at before we expect the pre-election polls this year to be as accurate as they've been in past years. Chris put up the 2008 Democratic primary in New Hampshire, where we saw polling indicating a sizable Obama lead right before the primary, yet Hillary Clinton won by 3 points. I could have showed the 2004 pre-election polls in New Hampshire, and all of them got it dead right. So methodologies that worked for many state pollsters 4 years ago in New Hampshire for the Democratic primary failed in 2008. There are other general elections where that happened as well. In 1980, most of the polls showed a close race, and yet Ronald Reagan won by 10 points. The main lesson there was polling wasn't done until the last weekend of the race, where there was tremendous movement. Even in 1996, all the polls showed a big Clinton win, but when the votes were counted, he won by about 5 or 6 points less than the pre-election polls were saying he would. So let's look at some lessons we may learn after 2008. And I know those of you who are here are consumers of these state polls. That's why you're here. I think that's why the topic interested you. I assume that you go to pollster.com, Real Clear Politics, 538.com, the dozens of other websites out there that look at this data. There's even a website that aggregates the aggregates. You can go to an electoral vote site where you can get the 70 electoral vote projections that are being done, and they average the averages for you. So this idea of aggregation, while having a very good recent history, we have to be careful to weigh on it too much in the future. What are some lessons to learn in the state polls? Well, in the primaries, you saw New Hampshire, you saw other states where Obama was overstated, California, Massachusetts, Ohio, Texas, South Dakota. There were numerous examples where Obama was overstated in the pre-election polls compared to the actual results. But there were similar number of states where Hillary Clinton was overstated in the pre-election polls. South Carolina, Virginia, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Indiana, all of those pre-election polls in those states underestimated Obama's final margin of victory in those primaries. So there isn't a clear lesson to learn nationally or across the board in all the states of polling. Some things you want to look at are the basics, lessons we have learned over the decades. You want a sufficient sample size. A lot of state polls are doing very small sample sizes. Look at the sample size of the poll to see just simple margin of error based on the sampling size. Are they accurately modeling the expected turnout? That's one of the issues Chris mentioned in New Hampshire. There was a spike in turnout, record high turnouts on the Democratic side, and the pre-election polls that did not predict that were off in their results. On the Republican side, the turnout was exactly the same as 2004, and the pre-election polling was right on the Republican side. So are the pre-election state polls accurately modeling turnout? There's a lot of talk this year of increased turnout. Will the pre-election polls reflect that? And interviewing as close as you can to Election Day. There can be changes in very short periods of time. We have seen just in the last 2 weeks with the economic news, the debates, and other things that are going on, you see dramatic changes in short periods of time. That can happen over the last weekend. So looking at a polling average the Friday before Election Day and comparing it to the results on Tuesday, there may be true changes that happen in those last few days, and you want to make sure those are caught. Those are kind of the traditional basics that we've learned over the years. But pollsters, I think, this year are going to learn a lot more because there are new challenges and growing problems that even pollsters admit they don't have the answers for. One is early voting. How many of you have already voted? I have. I voted yesterday. You voted. In New Jersey, you can walk into your courthouse today and vote. You can get your ballot mailed to you and vote days before the election. This makes it very difficult for an exit pollster because if you're not exiting the polling place on Election Day, it's pretty tough for us to interview you. So we have supplemented our exit polling with telephone surveys of early voters. But many of these polls that are being done down the stretch ask the question, if the election were held today, who would you vote for? It's a snapshot in time. Well, for some people, they haven't made that decision because they haven't voted yet. Some people have made that decision because they've already voted, and even if they change their mind, it's not going to change the outcome of the result. That's one of the reasons why the pre-election polling for the California primary was so off, because Hillary Clinton had banked so many early votes in California when she was ahead in the polls that even as Obama caught up later, so many votes had already been cast he couldn't catch up, even though the pre-election polls late in the contest showed him gaining ground. So how are these pre-election polls taking into account early voting that's already happened? As you saw, you get lower response rates. We see it in our exit polls, and telephone surveys are seeing it in their telephone surveys. Fewer and fewer people are agreeing to take the surveys. Maybe if we start paying them, they might agree to take them more. But how is that affecting the samples? We also saw Larry talk about cell phone only usage. How many people in this room do not have a landline phone?
All of the students.
Yeah. All right. So I assume that you haven't received a call from Survey USA or Gallup or anyone else in the recent past to measure who you're voting for. Well, that's a problem for us because you're part of the population. You're going to vote. Well, I assume you're going to vote. I didn't ask how many of you that are cell phone only aren't going to vote.
I already did.
So, but you're not in the population that makes the sample, that adds bias, adds inaccuracy to the sample, and we don't know yet how much effect that's going to have. We have some indications based on the data Larry showed from Pew that it could have an effect, especially among 18 to 29-year-olds, but we just don't know yet. There's another thing going on this year that didn't happen as much in 2000 and 2004. There have been tremendous increases in voter registration. By some accounts, 3 to 4 million new voters have registered this year, both in the primaries and for the general election. One of the questions that's asked in most of these state polls to determine if you're a likely voter is, did you vote in the last election? Well, if you weren't registered, you didn't vote in the last election, but you're registered now. You're probably more interested now. That's why you registered to vote. Yet the likely voter models that a lot of these state polls have don't take that into account. There's also approaching a dozen states now that allow same-day registration. You can just walk up on Election Day, show your electricity bill, prove where you live, and you can vote that day. Again, a pre-election poll that just asks, are you registered to vote? We'll miss those people because you haven't registered to vote yet because you're going to register on Election Day. So these are a lot of present-day complications that we just don't have as pollsters a lot of knowledge of how that's going to affect the outcome. So let me just leave you with a few questions, more questions than answers, I'm afraid, but we'll hopefully start getting the answers after we get the results on Election Day. Things to look at in these state polls as you evaluate them and as we evaluate them. How many state polls are being conducted in each state, and how many are being conducted in the last few days of the campaign? I'll do a little defense of Gallup. I think a lot of Gallup's polls weren't done that last weekend before the election in some of those states. That may have contributed to some of the error in some of those states. How are the state polls taking into account the early voters or people who have already voted? In states like Oregon and Washington, where everyone votes by mail now, the pollsters there have learned to ask these questions. They learned to ask, have you already mailed in your ballot? Have you already decided who to vote for? And if you have, who did you vote for, instead of who are you going to vote for? There are a lot of other states like Colorado and Texas and New Mexico where more than half the voters will vote absentee or early. Are the pollsters that are doing state polls in those states taking that into account when they're asking the questions to the voters they're talking to? How are the state polls taking into account the changes in registration? Are these pollsters modifying their likely voter model to take into account that there are 4 million new voters this year that weren't registered 4 years ago? And how are the state polls taking into account the race of the candidates? This is an issue that we've seen in the primaries, we've seen in past elections. There's a lot of debate on whether there is this Bradley, Dinkins, Wilder effect, whatever it's called, where candidates, African-American candidates, are overstated in pre-election polls. A lot of the most recent evidence seems to say that's not the case in the last few years, but we really don't know. So I can't predict the results, but I can kind of predict the questions we're going to ask after we see the results. I started in this business in 1988, working at CBS News in the Election and Survey Unit after I graduated from Princeton in 1987. And I worked with a man named Richie Silverman who gave me the Silverman rule of elections. What will happen, but only in a way to cause the most possible work for the Election and Survey Unit. And he's always proven correct on that. We did 40 primaries that we never thought we'd conduct this year. We are seeing more polls than we've ever seen before. We are seeing more questions about the methodology used in these polls. And I can't predict what the result's going to be, but I can predict that after the election, we'll be doing a lot of study to figure out whether we got it right or got it wrong. Thanks.
Thank all four. Let me thank all of the panelists. We have a little bit of time for some questions, and there's some microphones here. While some brave people make their way to the microphones, I thought I'd ask a few questions. One question had to do with an alternative to polling, which is in-trade, or the Iowa electronic market, and I'm curious if, in particular, the practitioners think that those are useful indicators of the outcome. Second comment I have is question I have was for Andrew, is how much the role of the South has played in tilting of the state income share voting for Republican relationship, and is that a big part of the story? And then finally, I was going to ask about the role of sample weights, which was alluded to. It's related to the way age is weighted and turnout models and so on. We did one poll here, one state poll. Ed will remember, it was for the gubernatorial election in New Jersey, and I think the poll was reasonably well done by students. And then when we applied different plausible weights, you could swing the results by about 8 points. So I'm curious, when the margin of errors are calculated, it seems that the weights get ignored, and if you look across those polls, how much of the discrepancies can you account for purely by weighting? So why don't I ask you first about in-trade and then comment on the others?
Well, about in-trade, they're right until they're really, really wrong. I could have made a ton of money and be in jail if I had done so in New Hampshire, because the in-trade numbers right up until when the polls closed in New Hampshire had Obama trading at 90, 95 cents on the dollar and Hillary Clinton trading on 5 or 10 cents on the dollar, and yet we were seeing exit polls during the day that had them dead even. So the in-trade numbers are only as good as the information out there, and again, as the aggregate, just like the aggregate polls tend to have been correct over the last few elections, they're correct until they're disastrously wrong.
I'll just add a brief remark there. Obama was nearly at 70 3 or 4 months ago. and he's at about 70 now on in-trade. One of those is wrong. He's either a lot higher now or he was lower then. Their in-trade's quite volatile, so McCain was actually ahead of Obama a month or so ago, and that's nutty. I think those markets get blown around too much by what's in the newspapers.
I think if the government had invested in Obama a few weeks ago a few $100 billion, then maybe in trade and made some profit there, maybe we wouldn't be having all this mess now, which of course would mean that maybe McCain would be doing better, in which case the government wouldn't have gotten that payoff. So in which case the economy would be in bad shape.
As far as the sample weighting goes, that was an excellent point that I should have made more clearly, that one of the problems with all this additional weighting that we have to do to account for the missing young people is that we have a greater design effect. And that means our effective sample size is lower. So if we're doing 1,000 interviews, our effective sample size is, well, maybe it's 700 something. And I think a lot of organizations just completely ignore the design effect, even though they do weight, and they just pretend it's not there, which obviously you shouldn't do. I had my client ask me from Minnesota, he said, how come our poll has a 3.7 margin of error, and we have about 1,100 cases, and they have 670 cases, and they have 3.5 or something like that. And I'm sure that's what's going on. And I don't know whether it's just, deception or it's ignorance is bliss or why this goes on, but it does.
Yeah, luckily that isn't an issue in social science because there's always a unique regression specification for us to pick. And so I think we're in a much better position than those pollsters who have to actually make subjective decisions. So it's a relief that we don't have to do that at all. Briefly, the pattern of rich states and poor states diverging among richer voters occurs in the country as a whole, not just the South. The South is part of it, and race is part of it also, but it's not merely a story of the South. It's happening in other places as well.
Yes, please. Why don't you identify yourself, too?
I'm Aaron Strauss. I'm a fourth year politics student here. Since Chris's office is right across from mine, I feel more comfortable picking up him. So in your slide about challenges to state polls, you said that they should incorporate economic information. But don't you want, in some cases, the state polls to be snapshots of what's happening right now so that you can tell what the AIG bailout as a whole, how that affected the race? So to all of you, really, what do you think the balance should be between horse race, what's happening right now, and projection, between what media people send out, what's on web, how we should analyze things? Do you feel we have the right balance now, and what do you think the ideal balance should be?
Of course, you're right, Aaron, and there just are two purposes to these polls. What I'm probably irritated by is all the time I spent in February reading the polls. I know better than to do that, but I can't help myself. And that's a waste of time, as you and I have discussed before. So it'd be nice if we could read the polls in February and skate to where the puck is going to be. And right now, I think we don't know how to do that.
Another question? Well, while other people might be formulating a question, let me ask this about the averages. I always wonder why, when averages of the polls are calculated, the margin of error is ignored. Now, of course, it's not just one poll, but if you're averaging over estimates, then you could get an estimate of the average. Get an estimate of the sampling variability of the average. And sometimes it's even reported because this is an average of polls, there is no margin of error, or the margin of error is not possible, which clearly is wrong. So I guess that's one question I have. Why is the margin of error ignored for the overall averages?
To the extent that non-sampling error is large, it will be larger than sampling error. Then it will be most appropriate to just simply average them. or something approximating that. I mean, if all the polls are estimating the exact same number, then sure, you might as well weight them by their margin of error. But I think
sorry, my question was,
but I don't think
why
you
not
are.
report the margin of error of the average? It could be an arithmetic average or a weighted average.
But I mean, I think it's like a lot of times if you have time series, you have an estimate for like once a month or once a week or whatever, the variation from week to week is providing you with an internal measure of error. So I don't see that. Like, sure, you could give me a standard error, like the aggregate is Obama at 53.4% plus or minus 0.03% or whatever, but I would sort of ignore it anyway. I would just be looking at the time series anyway. So it's like a lot of things. Once it's replicated, you have an external validation, in which case the internal standard error is something you might ignore anyway.
Well,
Right, Chris?
Essentially, yeah. But what I liked about Alan's suggestion was that calculating just a, standard deviation and treating it like a sample of a mean would pick up house effects, which repeated samples by a single house won't do, as you and I know well. So I think there's a lot to be said for that suggestion.
And I think we're seeing a lot more complex analysis of polling out there. And what Charles Franklin's doing on Pollster.com is getting at those house effects just by comparing different surveys done by different organizations compared to the mean. What Nate Silver's doing at 538.com is using past history to judge the weighting of each survey, not just the sample size, but its past accuracy in how much he weights that survey into his averages. They're not pure averages, they're weighted averages as well. Again, these are kind of practical solutions looking at the accuracy of these polls after the fact and then trying to model based on them. But there are people doing non-straight averages out there.
For those of you who don't do this stuff for a living, house effects are the tendency for a particular survey firm to be a little more Republican or a little more Democratic than the actual outcomes, and that's just a common feature. They work hard to get rid of it, but sometimes they just can't. So there's some variation across the polls. It's just due to the way the survey is conducted.
There's also a problem with transparency that not all these pollsters give out the information you would need to make more precise calculations and margins of error and such. And as I just pointed out, for example, with the calculation of the margin of error, many just don't factor in any design effects. So how would you deal with that?
Yes.
I guess my question is mostly for Hugick, but building off something Jablonski said. How do you vary your likelihood voter models by state with these varying electoral institutions? And how sensitive are your results, particularly in this other example, which does have same-day voter registration, to those likely voter models?
You should introduce yourself by saying this is the winner of the department pool for the Democratic nominee, the Republican nominee, and the Republican vice presidential nominee. He got all three of those.
I hope he put some money down in InTrade.
Everybody does that differently, I think. There's a lot of variation in it. Some pollsters will look at a past election and make this election fit to that election in terms of how the geography of the state turned out and so forth. We tend not to do that. We tend to try to get a balanced sample demographically based on census information, screen for people's registration status or plans to register in a same-day state, and then use some turnout questions to try to determine who's a likely voter and who's not. Both methods have had success, and it varies from organization to organization.
Yes, please.
My question, there was we were talking about that the income disparities. It seemed right to me for cities to say that the lower income, more Democratic want to go, and then the more higher income Republican. But for rural areas,
Yeah, a lot of the differences between red and blue states are differences between urban and non-urban places. In rural areas, there are bigger differences between how rich and poor vote, that rich are more Republican relative to the poor, and the differences are smaller in urban areas.
Yes, please.
It's been pointed out that in 2004, the polls were quite accurate with respect to the key states of Ohio and Pennsylvania, but very inaccurate with respect to Florida. I was wondering how that could be explained. What happened? What went wrong in Florida?
Well, I think Joe pointed out something before, that you can have real late shifts at the end, and I don't think we can completely eliminate the fact that as late as these polls are done, it's hard to do it right up until people go into the booth and vote. So there is that. Unfortunately, I haven't studied the specific case enough to know, what else about Florida other than what we went through in 2000. That Florida has just seemed to be difficult. I wish I had the answer.
One big change between 2000 and 2004 in Florida was the percentage of early voters. There were so many Democrats that were angered by what happened in 2000 and the long lines and the bad ballots and the questioning about miscounting or not counting dimpled chads or whatever, that people decided to avoid all that by voting early. And there was a tremendous increase in early voting in Florida. It went from about 10% to close to 30% of votes now in Florida are cast early. I think that changes how these polls are done. When you assumed in the past that early voters historically, until the last decade, have tended to be more Republican. They tended to be wealthier, and in most states, but not all states, that tended to be more Republican. Democrats since 2000 have done a much better job of getting their partisan voters to vote early, and I think that change in Florida may have affected how these polls were done.
Was an issue in Florida people who had dual residences and weren't sure if they would vote in Florida or?
It's fine. A lot is made of that. There was a big expose in the New York Post or Daily News where they found, thousands of people that lived in New York and also lived in Florida that voted in both places. A lot of that is just because these voter rolls are so dirty and people aren't removed from their voter rolls. There isn't a lot of evidence that we're talking more than a handful of voters where that's the case.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let me thank the panel again. I think the discussion was excellent, and we look forward to all the work you're going to do after the election to untangle things. Thank you very much.